I put this in is that the idea is that often we internalize capitalism, we internalize colonialism without even knowing it, right? We think we're our own person. We think we walk through the world with, hopefully, with grace and care for other human beings. But we also are part of a capitalist system. And so one of the things that we have to think about is, are we fearful of freedom? What happens when you pull yourself out of that capitalist system? Because if all of the norms in society, right, everyone in society is saying you have to be a certain way. If you step out of that, or if you don't even step out of that, but you're born into poverty, so you don't have the marks of whatever it is that makes people feel successful, then often we end up just trying to chase that same system, because what we're wanting is what? Acceptance, right? So it's not just about our daily needs anymore. Economics is not ever only about our daily needs. It's about all of these things that make us feel valued as humans. And one of the interesting things that feminists and civil society groups and social movements are trying to think through is, how do we have those really real conversations about this as economics as well? So that people are not just making the decisions about things based on what the system says, as if it's the only way to be in the world. But actually, there are many, many ways to be in the world. There are many alternatives. And if we're not careful, we get locked into what those with money and power say are the main or only ways to be in the world. Yep, economically or otherwise. So that's why I wanted to use these 4 slides, because I think they're an interesting way to think about issues of, are we the kind of person who looks at this and says, this is a terrible thing that we all are following the same thing, that we all want to look the same way, that we all want a car each at home, that we all want a big house, that we all want the fancy bread and not the long loaf from wherever, that we want the latest smartphone and not the one that's 5 years ago model? Do we all want to be with the big guns in, whether it's the big organizations, INGOs, whether it's the big brands for fashion? What are the things that we want? Do we want the big diamond ring? When someone says that they want to marry someone else, why is there a ritual still where we are supposed to have these big flashy rings? Why is that what we are trying to do when the earth is already in trouble? Why would that be a good thing? So that's why I've got the teary face in the middle, which can then move to, really, I might be the person who says, yes, this is exactly what I want. This is exactly what will show that I'm successful. I've worked really hard. It's not for you to tell me whether or not I'm able to have those 2 cars. It's not for you to tell me whether or not I eat fast food or not. Yes, I want that diamond ring. I worked hard for it. Why should I not have it? So all of these negotiations as a consumer are made from a particular political position. So even economics is incredibly political. It is about power. It is about negotiation and what you think is of value. What is a need and what is a must? So it's not just the issue of saying this is good or bad. It's about saying, what is your relationship with capitalism? What is it that you want for your life? And what is it that will make it useful and happy for you? Is this something that makes you feel sad? Do you look at it and you go, oh, poor people, they don't have the flashy brands, right? Or are you someone who says, this is genuine ecological living? And these are appropriate clothes for the very hot days in the Pacific. And these are wonderful, beautiful sets of art. and look at that amazing fruit that we buy from the local market that overseas would be 10 times the price, and they'd call it organic. So it is, again, about the way that we construct meaning. What is it that we need? What is it that we want? And what makes us feel good about what we have in our lives? And what does the system tell us? Because if these brands are telling us that you will only be a good person when you have those certain brands, or you'll only be a fancy person when you have those certain clothes, a person of value, then we should think very carefully about whether we can make these ecological shifts. Because we already know, remember back to our arc, if we keep going the same way, and I just give the fashion industry as one example, the fashion industry is one of the largest polluters in the world, whether it's because of the dyes, whether it's because of what we call a quick cycle of clothing. Now they change the clothing in these giant supermarkets around the world every couple of weeks. There's new clothes that are coming out of factories that are being sold around the world. And then once they can't be sold in a first world country, they send those clothes to a second world, third world, whatever country that they can keep moving it through the system. And it becomes waste. And it's dealt with by people in countries who didn't make that fashion in the first place. Or if that fashion was made in one of the countries in the South, they often paid very, very tiny wages under very poor conditions. And then those clothes, there's a fancy label put on it, and there's a 500 times markup, and it goes back to the first world country, and it's worn as a designer brand. That also is about economics, right? So it's about not getting caught in what is good or bad or fancy or not fancy, but saying, I understand as a person that this is part of an economic system that is about capitalism. It is about profit. So I have to think very carefully about where I get on that bus and where I get off. And that's my right to make those choices. And is it possible for me to make those choices easily, or it's very hard? Does my government help me to make those choices in a good way, or they're not helping me? And that's how I should vote. Because that's why I should be part of the economic system, is to work out where it's serving me and where it's not, as a majority South person. So I hope that's been useful to think about, because we already know that we're not doing very well in terms of putting our attention in the right place, right? So that's why I love this slide, which is, stop only talking about the little fancy things like turning off your air conditioning or no plastic straws, but look at the fact that really what the climate disaster is about is how bad our economic system is and how much it is destroying us, other species, 200 species a day going extinct, right? So it's destroying us, other species, and the planet. That's why if you look, and we've got Lani in the room who's a lawyer as well, we are starting to talk about rights of nature. And why are we doing that? Because we have to fight back with nature now. There are areas of indigenous land that they are now giving rights, so that that area is looked on as having some rights, that you can't just do what you want to do to it, that you have to think about the rights of nature. And these laws are being brought into being across the world as a thing called environmental justice or ecological justice, because we're doing such a bad job of taking care of ourselves and the planet. So absolutely, it's about economics. And then to just very quickly, before we go on another break, neoliberalism is about saying there's a kind of capitalism that is the worst of capitalism, right? And this neoliberalism is what some people call radical capitalism. Other people call it late stage capitalism. but it's basically where the state, where the government starts to deregulate, take away the rules and regulations within a nation state. So it's basically like the private sector gets to do what it wants. They destroy the union, and this has been happening over the last century, is that they've basically worked to take apart the system of unions that have fought. One of the things that I say that people don't think about economics is the reason why you can go to work and have an 8-hour day is because feminists and unionists worked for you to have that 8-hour day. Otherwise, you might be working 12 to 16 hours a day. But we worked for that, and we worked for you to have 2 days off minimum at the weekend. In France now, there are many people who work a 4-day week because their unions managed to find ways to work with the state, and now they do 4-day weeks and 3-day weekends. That's not everywhere across the world, but there are certain places where that's being negotiated by unions. So of course, neoliberalism wouldn't like that, right? It wants people to work for the maximum amount of time so that we can get the maximum amount of profit. It's very simple. It is about profit, always. Not about well-being or care for each other or rest, all of those other things that make us human. Remember Maslow's hierarchy again? Neoliberalism only exists to be there for profit. And in the end, because it acts as if everything has no boundaries, it acts like our planet has no boundaries, right? It keeps taking. That's why we call it an extractive economy. So it just keeps taking until the situation is so bad that we are now trying to work out what we can do, and we're calling it climate change. But really what it's about is awful economic practice that has brought us to ecological damage in the whole planet. That's what's happening. So we have to be very clear on that, so that when we're speaking back to neoliberal economies and we're making our positions, not just to our own government, but to other governments around the world, to the worst polluters, we have to be clear that we're saying, you have to change your economics. We can't just say, bring down the emissions. Bring down how? Because if we're saying we're going to trade it, you don't do your emissions there and I will plant some trees here in Fiji, and then we will feel better and you can pay me to plant these trees here. There's a scheme called Red Plus that does that. The problem with that is that if you do that, you're just moving the emissions around the world. There's actually nothing happening to bring down the emissions. So that means that we're not solving the problem. And neoliberalism likes that because it just wants to keep making more profit. So one of the most terrible things about neoliberalism is, on one hand, they're saying publicly, we are moving towards a green economy, right? You might have started to hear this language. And at the very same time, those companies are putting billions to, the figure last year was $1 trillion, still into fossil fuels investment. At the very same time as they're saying, we're getting off it, we understand how bad it is. They had the biggest delegation at the climate change summit last year. The biggest delegation was from private sector, bigger than any government that was there. But at the same time in that year, and in the same year that we had the pandemic, they were putting money into coal and fossil fuels. So we have to hold them accountable for that. Yeah. It's depressing, but it's better we know so that we can do something about it, so that we speak truth to power. Because what do we know? We already know that nothing changes without us pushing power. They're not just going to all wake up one day and go, oh, right, I've learned my lesson. Now I'm going to be a good corporate citizen and I'm going to do the right thing by the peoples of the world. No, we have to push them. And it's always been like that. Change has always been like that. So one of the things that we have to put all our governments under pressure, including the biggest ones, which have the biggest fossil fuel companies in them, is to say, we see you and we know the part that is about economics. Move you move the policy, and we always say move the money. So one of the things is that we know that in the last 40 years, there's been 56 US military interventions in Latin America. Why? Because there are certain relationships between those countries and those who produce fossil fuels. There are certain relationships, so they have done things like engineered coups and regime change. This is already documented. We know this. These are the ones we know about. So one of the things that governments have to do is they have to be honest about what they're doing. The second thing is that we have to disrupt these chains, economic chains, that keep the money moving between what we call the military-industrial complex. So one of the things that happens is, so if you just look at that triangle, right? So Congress in the US, it takes some of the money that people pay in taxes and it gives it to the Department of Defense, right? So it's just the same as every year money goes to certain ministries. And then that money goes to contracts. And who are the contracts with? Large military corporations. Who are the ones who are manufacturing bombs, who are manufacturing the big jet fighters, all of the equipment of war. And they then, what do they do to the Congress in the US? They give money to the politicians. They give money to the political parties. So it becomes just this lovely triangle that just keeps going round and round and round. And that's what we call the military-industrial complex. And that's what feminists and ecological economists are interested in. Don't just talk to us about gross national product and what kind of products we're making and what kind of tourism we're doing, but talk to us about the deeper, darker things that are about this, and that we have to disrupt what is happening in these very large sets of relationships. And we have to get off this roller coaster. You've seen this slide many times now, because we are creating a world in which we are scooping out everything that is best about us. And then we call it economics. So we have to be careful what we call good economics. And you've all seen this one. I'm not going to spend time, but to say, you all know now, even more, I hope, after today, that the same people are on these boards. They might be on 10 boards, and they're all in relationship with the prime ministers, with the presidents around the world, and they're constantly talking to them and lobbying, right? Just like we have to be in their faces. That's why we can't afford to be sweet and kind and come to them with our hands held out. No, we have to be fierce, and we have to have our statistics and our analysis in place so that we can say, we see you, we know what you are doing, and we know that the environment is in trouble, and we know that our children are in trouble, and we know that it is because of your economic decisions. So all of these things are about, the reason why we do these sessions is not just so that we're saying to ourselves, this is what economics is. It's because we have to then integrate it back into our own sets of work in our lives and go, no matter who I am, what is the work that I can do to change this ugly system? Because it is an ugly system. Yeah. How do we shift that? Can we do it on our own? No way. So we have to be part of social movements that are working for this. But if we never talk about economics in this way, then we won't feel like we can make a change in our own places. We won't know what to speak to our governments about. When the budget comes out every year, do you feel like you are part of that relationship with your government? Do you feel like you know what they're saying? Because that's taxpayer funds. They are representing a group that is entrusted to do some work with those funds in a system that is both national, regional, and global. So we have to know what we're talking about in order to do that work with them. Because otherwise you end up with this. Did you see Elon Musk? He's not even in this picture, but he's the 9th one, right? He just bought Twitter for 49 billion. Imagine, 49 billion. And then the question I have for all of you is, imagine if you put that 49 billion into poverty work. Imagine if you put that into climate justice work. Imagine if you gave it to the countries who are going to lose all their land because you all have been the ones who polluted most around the world. But instead, it's going to buy Twitter, a social media platform. So that's where we have to think about economics and how did we get to this place? And how do we very quickly, the quickest that humans are, how can we get out of it? And the way we can get out of it is by being clear about what is nonsense, right? Look at this. This is what we call the spaghetti bowl of free trade associations. Imagine if you're running a country and these are the kinds of relationships that you are expected to negotiate. Imagine. Fiji is part of this system, right? Papua New Guinea, Tuvalu, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, all of us are trying to negotiate, not just within our small part of the Pacific, but with all these other relationships. And one of the things that feminists are always asking is some of the reason why we have these free trade agreements and why we have these bilateral trade agreements, is it because you want to keep us tied up? Because that's a lot of paper, right? That's a lot of things that we're having to negotiate when we've got a lot of very hard problems to solve as small island countries. So one of the things that we need to ask ourselves and ask our leaders and insist to other countries is make sure that you're not just giving us these silly trade negotiations that actually are about nothing except the old terrible relationships we've had in the past. Because we have to move to something different. I just gave you this information about PESA Plus. This is just a set of, it's just to show you how much change is happening in economics all the time. You don't have to read this one, but to tell you, one of the dangers now is that in the past, we used to have agreements where they would do different kinds of relationships with us because we were small, right? So there was an agreement, for instance, that Australia would work with us in a different way, that we wouldn't have to open our economy up because they're bigger and they have all the power. So that was the relationship. Now, under PESA Plus, we are supposed to open up our end as well. So everyone in Fiji who has, if you are part of this agreement, and we haven't signed on yet, thank goodness, but if we were signed on to this agreement, it would mean that if you had a company in Australia, you have free flow to come into our country and to compete with local businesses. And that's a problem, right? Why? Because we have old sets of problems with development. We don't have all of the resources that they have in Australia. Why? Because they had colonialism on their side. Because they had the chance to develop like that because they took it. So that means that they now can come into a country and compete with us on an equal footing? No way. And that's why we exist as civil society, is to say no way. And to be very clear on why no way. But unfortunately, many of the countries have already signed on. So I just wanted to give that as an example. Don't feel like you have to read all of that, but it's about saying 8 have already signed on, right? So the last bit of this section is to say whatever it is that we're talking about, whether it's fisheries, whether it's gender, whether it's poverty, whether it's roads, whether it's housing, water and sanitation, if it's of interest to us, it's of economic interest to somebody else. And that means that we have to be clear that a big part of our role is protecting the interests of Pacific peoples and working out how best to do that. Not just because it's always been done that way, that's the way we do it as civil society. We have to really analyze it ourselves and say, what is the best economic position for peoples of the Pacific? Yep. Because now we're coming into this set of our lives where climate change has an impact on every part of our lives. So it's not even just normal times, right? It's also about it's about climate change right now. And as Berta, one of our longtime friends and colleagues who was assassinated actually in Honduras, says, as long as we keep capitalism, our planet can't be saved because it's the complete opposite of life. We need to end capitalism to save the world and humankind. So that was one of the messages that she worked very much on. She was trying to save a dam, and they think it was the private sector who had her killed. So that was, I think, about 5 years ago, Berta was killed. And this is to say that economics is very dangerous business because it's about money. And that means that we have to try and solve a lot of the problems before they get huge. And that means keeping our eyes and our ears and our hearts and our work open so that we do some of that ecological work as well.